Again, we have Saul joining us for the more powerful multi-methods talk, where he talked about Methodical. Cam lives in San Francisco and is a lead backend engineer at Database. He's been writing Clojure professionally since 2013, and in past lives, he worked as a C++ programmer, an iOS dev. When he's away from the REPL, you can find Cam backpacking outside, snowboarding, mountain biking, and he has this really dope picture of a toucan on his bio picture in the Clojure North website. Check it out. So whenever you like, Cam, feel free to take away, maybe give a little bit of an introduction, and everyone else, feel free to start writing up your questions for Cam to answer.
Yeah, hey, so that just about sums it up. One quick clarification, though. I work at Metabase, not Database, but Database sounds pretty cool. If that was a company, I would work there instead. So that's it about me. So go ahead and ask me any questions that you guys have about Methodical, and I'll try to give you some good answers.
Yeah, I think it always takes time for people to start typing things out. One thing I was curious about, and I figured this probably isn't the goal of Metabase, or not Metabase, Methodical. So I know that multi-methods in Clojure aren't as performant as dropping down to something in Java like through protocols. But have you like benchmarked Methodical at all to see how it compares?
Yeah, so I've benchmarked it quite a bit as I've been working on it, and my main goal was to have it be as performant as Clojure multi-methods, like default normal ones, and that's pretty much been achieved. Like it's about the same. Performance is about the same as the ones that ship with Clojure, which I think is. I'm happy with that because of the methodical multi-methods are quite a bit more complicated, and there's quite a bit more that can happen, such as the auxiliary methods. But it's still not as fast as using a protocol, for example. And that's because the protocols have a more performant caching mechanism than multi-methods have. So that's something that I definitely want to look at in the future. You could, if specifically when we're dispatching just on the class of something, I think it would be possible just to leverage the same cache used by protocols, which would give you like a nice performance boost. But that's something I haven't really got the chance to look into a whole lot just yet, but I want to in the future.
Nice. Yeah, that answers that. Dan messaged in the Slack. One thing I worry about with more complex multi-method schemes is losing track of the dispatch hierarchy. You have a good process for keeping the mental model clear.
Yeah, you know what? That is totally a valid point. I think the biggest concern I have heard from people who I've like shown this to is just that it could make debugging things more complicated or kind of hide away some things. I guess with more power comes the potential to abuse that power somewhat, uh, and kind of like hide where things are happening. So that's definitely something I tried to build into Methodical, several like utility methods that can help you look at the hierarchy. And of course, you can use like the same ones that ship with Clojure. You can look at like, well, the hierarchy itself is just a map, or you can look at, you can call parents, or you can call ancestors, children, descendants. There's like a handful of functions for that. But it's definitely something that I think could be improved. If you have like a big hierarchy with dozens or more keys in it, then it can be kind of hard to figure out things. Like, let's say you have like a toucan is a bird, is an animal, right? And and kind of like seeing that relationship isn't really easy to do from the REPL if you have, say, like 1,000 different animals in there. So that's definitely something that I think can be improved, not just for Methodical specifically, but just using big hierarchies in general. Some kind of tooling, maybe even some some sort of thing that draws a graph for you. I don't know. That's a good question. Something I definitely want to look at more in the future. Are people typing questions in the Slack channel or?
So far, no more questions there, but just pictures of toucans.
Which Slack channel is this one?
So it's in the talks channel.
Oh yeah, okay. Oh yeah.
I see a couple people typing, but we'll see. Okay. So Steven's asking, I also love the idea of stealing ideas from other languages. How much time did you have to spend with CLOS to write your library?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Like, I've played around with Common Lisp in the past, like a little bit here and there, but I'm definitely not by any means like an expert, and I haven't built big things in it. So I was like tangentially aware that these features existed, but I wasn't super familiar with how they worked. So I did spend a lot of time, like specifically the book Object-Oriented Programming in Common Lisp. Like I kind of read through that and a few other books to try to learn more about how it works in Common Lisp. My main goal wasn't to like fully understand that, but just kind of like to like understand the implementation in Common Lisp. It was kind of more just to like figure out what the features did and bring them to Clojure. So if you want, I see there's another question. Yeah, if you want to learn more about CLOS, that's a good book, I think. Object-Oriented Programming Common Lisp. So to answer the first question, I didn't spend a ton of time other than kind of just learning about it and reading about it and maybe like opening a REPL up to kind of experiment with things and made sure my mental model of how it worked was correct. I spent a lot more time in Clojure trying to get things working in a way that I thought made sense in Clojure.
Nice. And John asked, does Methodical take any inspiration from the faster multi-methods library? I don't know if you've looked at that one.
Yeah, I have not looked at that one at all, and that's kind of a shame because it looks like a cool library. Yeah. So the answer to that question is no, but I'm gonna definitely take a look at this library after this Q&A is over and see if I can learn or borrow anything from that. It looks interesting just from looking at it real quick.
Cool. And there's a question from Christian. Can you explain a bit more about the Common Lisp object system?
Yeah, so I kind of touched on that a little bit a second ago, but it's really, Rich Hickey came out with a paper, I think, earlier this year called History Clojure, and he kind of briefly touches on it, like the CLOS Common Lisp object system has this, well, on the one hand, it has classes, and the way you define them is kind of some like roughly equivalent to how you define like a def type enclosure. There's like a lot of differences that I don't think are really important to get into, since this is dealing with like the other half of CLOS, which is kind of, they call it generic functions in Common Lisp, but it's really the same thing as multi-methods and Clojure. And kind of the way they work in Methodical is very similar to how they work in CLOS. Like you have the primary methods, which are the ones you're familiar with in Clojure already. You have the auxiliary methods like before and after and around. And if anyone out there is like an Emacs user and you're familiar with like function advice, where you can have before advice, that after advice or around advice, that's kind of also like a very similar concept. So you could kind of think of Clojure multi-methods as a subset of the functionality in CLOS, and that was kind of one of my goals with Methodical, is to bring a fuller subset, or even maybe a superset of that functionality to Clojure. And again, if you want to learn more about it, Object-Oriented Programming in Common Lisp is probably the best book on the subject, I think. Practical Common Lisp touches on it too. So that's another good one to look at. There are a lot of really interesting features, I think, that we can kind of like learn from in Clojure. Like people spend a lot of time thinking about this, these kind of things back in the day, the 80s or 90s. And I think that a couple other good ones like are like On Lisp by Paul Graham or Let Over Lambda, which came out pretty recently. They're like really full of like mind-blowing like Lisp ideas. Okay.
So you got a question in the queue.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, so how quickly did the Metabase team adopt Methodical, and are there still multi-methods in the code base that would benefit from conversion to Methodical's multi-methods? The answer to that is we kind of adopted it for some things right away, but converting other things to it is still an ongoing process. There's like Metabase is like a pretty big code base. I think the Clojure code is like 100,000 lines now, so it's not gigantic, but it's not small either. So my general way to approach this has been kind of to slowly migrate things over, so we can spend time like building new features and fixing bugs, and not just a bunch of time switching stuff out that already works. So there is still a lot of stuff that would benefit. I think I kind of touched on this in the talk a little bit, but some of like the limitations that we ran into with like normal multi-methods in Clojure were one of the reasons I wanted to build this library. Like I think the main example is in Metabase. When we read columns from a database, we dispatch on both the type of the database and the type of the column. And in normal Clojure multi-methods, you can't really do what I was calling partial default dispatch. Partial default dispatch. So you can't say, I want to write a method that handles strings for any kind of database, unless of course like you put all those keys in a hierarchy. But then that kind of like gets you into other problems, because then if someone goes and adds like support for another database, they have to go play with the hierarchy. And so that's like one thing. And just like the fact that, like, let's say, like, I'll give you an example from like a real world example. When you're reading a timestamp column from Postgres, whether it's a timestamp with time zone or timestamp without time zone, they'll both come back and they'll both say that they're a timestamp. But if you try to read one and it has a time zone, and you try to read it as one of the new Java 8 types, it'll just fail. So you have to actually use a different method to see what the actual database type is. And so like with normal Clojure multi-methods, it's hard to say, okay, like I want to like check something, and if it's this one case, I want to use like the parent multi-method, and if not, I'll do something else. There's no like in Methodical and CLOS, this is called next method, right? And there's no easy way to do that. You can get the method from a multi-method, but you have to know what the parent method is, like what its dispatch value is ahead of time. So it kind of ruins the ability to let you play with the hierarchy, put new stuff in there without having to know about it ahead of time. Makes it less flexible. So I think that kind of is the state of things with Metabase. You see what the next question is. Yeah, anything else you'd like to steal from Common Lisp? Yeah, you know, that's a great question. I think one thing I really miss in Clojure is the fact that you can just like return anywhere, you know, like you can say return from and then just have your whole function return. So maybe that's a pro and it's a con. I don't think it really negatively affects like the purity of your functions and makes your functions. I don't think it like if you have like a pure function, you have a bunch of code and it says return, and then the whole function returns, as opposed to nesting if or when or con statements. I don't think it like really affects the purity of the function or the elegance of it. I think that that's something that sometimes I think could lead to clearer code, maybe not. Um, that's probably the only other thing I think that I miss um, in terms of stealing stuff. I think the multi-methods were the main thing though. I've played around trying to write a macro to support return from, but it gets kind of messy when you want to like support it, and like if you do like a function call to somewhere else, and maybe it does get hairy at that point. I don't know. I haven't put that much thought into it, honestly. Oh yeah, Cognitive arguing that the number of exit points was a measure of simplicity. Yeah, that's definitely true. You know, there's different ways of looking at it, pros and cons. Um, I mean, you can write sloppy code with or without return in Common Lisp. You could write sloppy code in Clojure or elegant code. So with any of these tools comes great responsibility, right? Like just because it's there doesn't mean you should use it. Using it in places where it simplifies things, I think, is nice. If you can use it and avoid having to do a bunch of like nested like if statements or something wacky, then I would argue that makes your code easier to read. Certainly not the case everywhere. So pros and cons, I guess. But having the option to use it if you wanted to, I think is nice. Like no one's making you use it if it's there. Oh yeah, that's a good point. Common Lisp condition system's really cool. Yeah, kind of just like it's definitely a little bit easier to debug too. You know, like I know it's like kind of like a cliche now, but Clojure's like stack traces, like the big Java stack traces with like, geez, some of them are like, what is it, like 100 frames now, 200 frames when you're like looking at stuff. Being able to just like you run into an exception, like you're in the REPL, and then you can pick different ways to address it and continue in Common Lisp. It's definitely a little bit nicer to work with and debug, I think. Yeah, so that I guess would be something else that would be cool if it was in Clojure, but man, I have no idea how to port that. So maybe one day if I get bored and run out of stuff to do, I'll try to play around with that. Yeah. Oh yeah. These are all really good points. These are good points people are bringing up in Slack. Most common use case I can think of for reasonable use of return is handling preconditions or other interesting validation. Yeah, before multi-methods might be able to replace a lot of that as well. Yeah, totally, exactly. In that case, you could use return instead of having to have like an if statement and then nest the entire rest of the function body in that if statement in the else part. Cool. So does that answer that question? Do you have any other questions anyone's curious about?
Let's go. Oh, there's one that popped up in the QA section.
Oh yeah, so that's a great question. I think that was like the second one we talked about.
Oh, yeah.
So, but it's a quick answer, so I'll just go ahead and answer again. I did not know this library existed, so maybe I should have done more research before I just started writing stuff. Maybe this is really the curse of Lisp, you know? Instead of looking to see if other stuff existed, I just started writing stuff. The faster multi-methods library does look really interesting, and I'm definitely going to be reading through that source code and seeing if I could like copy any of the ideas there to try to speed up methodical multi-methods. I think performance wasn't one of my primary goals. I definitely wanted it to be comparable in performance to vanilla Clojure multi-methods, but that wasn't the main goal. Like if it was 90% as performant, but you could do all these other cool things with it, I would have counted that as a win. As it stands right now, it's pretty much about the same speed. It could totally be made faster, I think, with a little bit of work. And if it was actually like a lot faster than normal Clojure multi-methods, I think that would be like a really big selling point. So it's definitely something that's on my to-do list to look at that and kind of improve the performance. So I'm going to be taking a look at the library, seeing how they do it.
Yeah, from a quick look, I think that it's not like it does exactly the same thing. Like given its name, it's definitely focused more on getting performance under wraps, where you would include some sort of signature, it looks like.
Yeah.
And they do a lot of there's a lot of like Java class code underneath the hood to like define different types of signatures you might have.
Yeah. That's definitely something I've been looking at too, because we could kind of tell, like in a lot of cases, like especially like if we just look at the dispatch function and it happens to be class, then we know you're just dispatching off of the class of whatever the object is, right? So whatever the argument is. So that works pretty much just like a protocol. And in that case, like we can just use like the same caching mechanism that's used for Clojure protocols. And there's definitely like other ways we can look at the dispatch function and try to determine like what the dispatch values actually are and use like caches that make sense for different types. So like in terms of performance, like the way Methodical works and the way like normal Clojure multi-methods work is they build the function or find the appropriate function in the case of normal Clojure multi-methods, and then they cache a map of like the actual dispatch value, or the dispatch value you pass in to the actual function that gets used, the actual method implementation. So every time you invoke a multi-method, what has to happen is it calls the dispatch function and determines the dispatch value. So maybe you have 2 arguments, or maybe you have like 5 arguments to the function, but it just uses the first 2. And that's the dispatch function, and maybe it calls keyword on them, or maybe it calls class or something. So the dispatch function is one thing that happens basically every time, and then using that dispatch value to look up the correct method from the map. The cache happens every time, and it seems like a little bit like limiting, like I'm not 100% sure like just how much we can improve that. Like I'm still thinking of ways to kind of like maybe I mean, we have to use the dispatch function all the time, so if that can be like improved somehow, that could improve performance, and improving like the cache, like improving lookup times or things. Right now we're just using like a normal hash map, and Clojure multi-methods just use a map of some sort. I think it's also just a hash map. So if we could improve that cache lookup time, that's the other way to improve performance. Yeah, so like protocol caches, I think they're doing something different, which is a little bit faster. Definitely something to look at.
Nice. And you got a question in the QA section.
Oh yeah. Okay. Unrelated to talk, I was poking around in the Metabase code and noticed that when an error was thrown in the pipeline, the stack trace printed out pointed to where the issue happens. Yeah, so that is something I wrote and added to Metabase like a year ago. Like I said earlier, like because we're using like Ring with like all this middleware, and then like the way we've implemented the code for processing queries and transforming the queries that come in from the front end client, compiling them to like SQL or Mongo native queries is also written using middleware. So some of our stack traces like can end up being 100 something frames long, which is really hard to look at, really annoying. So I just wrote some code that like just finds the first frame that is actually Metabase specific code and just sticks a little arrow in it as part of formatting the exception when we return it in an API response, which I think personally makes debugging stuff like for me a little bit easier. I spend probably like 6 hours a day like poking around stuff in the REPL with Metabase. So that's made my life easier. It's not available anywhere as a library, but the code Metabase is open source. So I can point you guys to the actual like code if you want to steal it. You definitely like, that's definitely, it's just like a utility function. You're definitely free to copy it into your project and play with it. I'll find that after we're done doing Q&A because I don't want to poke around GitHub for like 2 minutes right now.
One thing I was wondering, so I know in your talk you have those multi-values you can dispatch the multi-method on in Methodical.
Yeah.
How funky can you get with that? Can you do like nested nested vector seeks, that kind of thing?
For dispatch, like,
Yeah.
yeah, you can do, so it works kind of like the same way like normal Clojure multi-methods do. That's, yeah, so I guess you should totally be able to like nest things as much as you want, but now that I think about it, I haven't actually tried that out. So it just does like a comparison for each argument. And I think the way, that's a good question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head. If it's not something you could do now, then it's something we could totally make it do. I had not thought of that. But yeah, it's Methodical. You should be able to do whatever you want. The cool thing about Methodical is if it doesn't support that, you could just write your own little dispatcher component without having to rewrite all the other stuff, without having to rewrite the code that tells it how to combine methods or how to store methods or any of that. So you could kind of just re-implement that functionality and do that yourself and still use everything else. So that's like kind of one of the benefits of it. Like with Clojure multi-methods, like you can't really change anything about how they work. And there's like a bug in Clojure multi-methods where it's not using the hierarchy to, or it's not using the preferences table or something for one of the method implementations. And like I submitted like a bug fix on Jira like 2 years ago and never got a response. So if you want to change how like Clojure multi-methods work, you're talking about like years for a pull request or whatever to maybe get merged, whereas with Methodical, you can just do whatever you want. So yeah, so I'll have to look at that and get back to you. That is definitely something that if it doesn't work now, let's open an issue and figure out how to make it working because it sounds fun.
Nice. Yeah. Any last questions for Cam in the last couple of minutes we have here? I don't see anyone typing. Yeah, okay. Well, thanks so much, Cam.
Yeah.
Appreciate having you and learning more about Methodical.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks everyone for all the great questions and good ideas and everything else too.